Welcome to the channel, I'm Tom. My table is here, it's just out of frame, don't worry, and this is the recommended PC for Starfield that is releasing later this year on the 6th of September. So today we're going to be taking a look at what this PC can do in two modern games. We're going to be having a look at Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and Cyberpunk because it has basically become the new crisis. And yeah, we're going to be seeing what it can do in those titles to sort of roughly get an idea of what you could possibly expect in Starfield, because as you can see behind me I have the Starfield minimum and recommended PC specs, but within those specs it doesn't actually tell us what that's sort of targeting. So is it 1080p 30, is it 1080p 60, is it 4K 30, something like that. But yeah, it just doesn't tell us. So we're going to have a quick look through the minimum requirements, then we'll get on to the recommended, and then we'll have a look at the PC and see what it can do, so we can see roughly what we can expect maybe. So moving on to the minimum PC requirements, we have the Ryzen 5 2600X or the Core i7 6800K. Now these CPUs are a couple years old now, or a few years old. I think the Ryzen came out in 2016, or no, 2018, and the Intel in 2016, if I'm getting those dates right. And yeah, they're pretty decent processors even today. The reason why probably the Intel one is an older one that matches the newer Ryzen is because Intel in those days, they were just better at gaming, even though now Ryzen has caught up and even sort of I'd say they trade blows. But yeah, Intel definitely used to be better core per core when it used to come to gaming. Now, interestingly, they are 6-core CPUs and 12 threads. So if you do have a 4-core processor, you're probably not going to have a good time with Starfield. Then moving on, we've got 16 gigabytes of RAM. That is the minimum. So I think pretty much any game these days, really, you're going to be looking at 16 gigabytes of RAM in a modern system. So I don't think that's too much of a surprise. Maybe for a minimum it could have been 8, but seeing that it's 16 is, yeah, I would say kind of expected. Then moving on to the graphics card, we have the Radeon RX 5700 and the Nvidia GTX 1070 Ti. Now these again are slightly older cards, but they were pretty much top tier cards when they came out, or you know, near top of their range when they came out. And yeah, again, interesting because they're not really that old, and for these to be the absolute minimum that it's saying that you need to, in order to run this at a playable frame rate, I'm guessing, yeah, it's kind of interesting. It kind of shows that Starfield is going to be a bit of a beast to try and run, I think. Also, what's interesting is this SSD is required, basically. So if you have a HDD, a hard drive, then I don't know if it'll even start. Maybe we can test it when it actually comes out. But it seems like it's not even going to let you boot it up, because I'm guessing that since we have cutscenes that transition us from takeoff into space, I'm guessing that a hard drive can't, you know, perform the loading required in the meantime as you're taking off in that cutscene to then get you in space on time. So that's why an SSD is probably required, just because of the much faster load times. And yeah, it shows that now a hard drive has reached that point where you kind of do need an SSD at all costs. So if you are someone that maybe has an SSD as a boot drive only, and then you have your other games installed on your hard drive, I'm sorry, but it is kind of time that you move to an SSD. So with these minimum requirements, I'm kind of going to go for that it's going for 1080p at 30 frames a second. Obviously no ray tracing because those graphics cards didn't support it at the time. But yeah, so I'm going to say that's 1080p 30 FPS, which if you think about it, I think they're pretty decent specs. And to only get 1080p 30 is a little bit of a worry. But then when we come to the recommended settings, it's a little bit strange, because to be honest, they're not that much better than the minimum requirements, in my opinion at least. So for the processors for the recommended, we have the Ryzen 5 3600X, so we've just gone up a generation from the 2600X. Now, in gaming, the 3600X was a decent leap over the 2600X, but again, still a 6-core, 12-thread CPU. And then for Intel, we moved up a fair bit, to be fair, up to the i5 10600K. Now, that's probably because over the generations, at that point in time, Intel did become a little bit lazy and stagnated because they had no competition. So Yeah, but it is a newer CPU than the Ryzen one that they're showing off there. But again, both processors, 6 cores, 12 threads. And then moving on to the graphics cards, we have the much newer RX 6800 XT, and that's compared to the Nvidia RTX 2080. Now, I think the reason for this might be when it comes to ray tracing performance, just because, as we all know, Nvidia is just much better at ray tracing performance. AMD has really struggled to catch up, and surprisingly, if you've seen some of the older videos that I've made, Intel is actually much better than AMD at ray tracing. So hopefully AMD catches up at some point in the future, but I think that's why they have gone with the RX 6800 XT, because it is better at rasterized performance than the RTX 2080, but again, ray tracing, it falls kind of short, so you're kind of looking at they're maybe neck and neck. Then moving on, the recommended specs are basically the same as the minimum. The only difference has been the processor and the graphics card, and to be honest, not by that much. I would say in the graphics card department, we've only gone up around 50% improvement, which is decent, but at the same time, if the minimum is targeting 1080p 30, like maybe the console, well, the consoles are actually doing it a little bit better, maybe 1440p 4K 30. But yeah, if the minimum is 1080p 30, then I would say that the recommended could be, I don't know, maybe 1080p 60 with ray tracing, or 1080p 30 with ray tracing. I'm really not sure, so I'll probably change what I think at the moment. So what we'll do now is this PC basically has the exact same recommended specs as we have on the sheet behind me. So in here we have the Ryzen 5 3600X. We do have 16 gigabytes of RAM. We have a 1TB SSD. We also have a RTX 2080 Super. So we're very, very slightly higher than the 2080, but to be honest, when the Super variants came out of the 20 series cards, it was a little bit of a joke. So we're only going to see about a 6 to 7% increase in performance over what the 2080 would be. So it's realistically not going to make much difference in the results that we see. So what we're going to do now is then we're going to jump into those two games. We're going to try a variation of presets and resolutions, and then at the end we'll have another quick look at what maybe the recommended and minimum specs might be targeting in Starfield. So yeah, let's get into it. Right then, so here we are in Cyberpunk 2077, and this was with no upscaling applied. It's on the high settings without any ray tracing, and as you can see, we're not doing too badly. I've seen we're basically in like the mid 70s, something like that, and I should probably actually watch where I'm going. But yeah, it's not looking too bad at the moment. Obviously in these little areas where there's slightly less lighting and people, we're going to get a higher frame rate, almost touching 100 there. As far as how everything's been utilized, the GPU is at a decent range at around 90. Oh my days, we just absolutely destroyed that. And yeah, CPU is working pretty hard, to be fair, at 1080p. But we're not really looking at bottlenecking at the moment, I wouldn't say. So yeah, also RAM usage around, well, basically 11 gigabytes. And as for the memory on the GPU, we're pretty much maxing it out at this point, because we only get 8 gigabytes, remember, with these sort of cards. And that has been a problem with some of the more modern cards as well, just having 8 gigabytes. So let us try turn ray tracing on and see what we get with that. So as you can see, still with no DLSS or anything like that, no resolution scaling. Everything is still on high, and then all we're going to do is we're going to put the ray tracing on to medium, turn on everything to do with it apart from the path tracing, which is to do with the overdrive mode, which we probably won't use because this might blow up. But we'll apply that and then see where we're at. And yeah, okay, so we've dropped significantly. We've probably just over halved our frame rate, but we are getting around about the 30 mark. We're dipping into the 20s, and you can really see the frame time graph, how it has actually changed, and we're getting a lot more spikes now that we have ray tracing turned on. So remember, this is just at 1080p again, so if Starfield does have ray tracing, which they haven't really confirmed, they just said there's global illumination, then it is holding around 30, which is good. Again, dipping into the 20s. But yeah, it is holding around that. So my guess might be that Starfield might be 1080p at 30 frames if you have ray tracing on with this solar system. But of course, it's most likely going to have DLSS and FSR 2.1 and that sort of stuff. So what we'll do is we'll try go to 4K with using the FSR and things like that, and then we'll see where we're at. So now we've gone on to 4K 3840 by 2160, and we're going to go back to our graphics settings, and all we're going to do is we're going to turn on DLSS, because this is a 20 series card, so it can do it. We'll put it on. I'm going to go for just performance straight out the gate and see what it's looking like there, but everything else has stayed the same. We're still on high, and ray tracing is still on medium. So let's give that a shot and see what happens. Oh dear. Oh dear. Okay. Well, okay. It's leveling out a little bit. It's yeah. I wouldn't call this playable, and this isn't even in like the super built up areas. Oh my days. It probably doesn't come across on video how choppy it actually is. But yeah, just by the frame rates you can probably tell. Let's actually get out and see if there's a little bit of a difference. Oh my god, that does look... Yeah, it's very, very choppy if you can see that. You wouldn't really be able to do much here, I don't think. Yeah, shooting's not exactly a good experience. So let's, now that we probably have police up against us, I'm not even going to be able... Oh my days, it's literally feels like it's going all over the place. Okay, 24 frames is not what you want to be shooting at. So let's just turn off ray tracing and see what it's like that. Oh dear. Wow, it's... Wait, what? How is it worse? How is it worse? It doesn't make sense. How is it actually worse? Oh no, okay, we've recovered. Oh wow, we have recovered. Oh Jesus. Oh my days. Okay, so yeah, we're looking at around 60 FPS, which is actually pretty good. Even if it is on performance, it is looking pretty damn good, to be fair. So this does give us hope that in Starfield, if you did have the ray tracing turned off and you were on this solar system, you wouldn't be looking too bad. Oh dear, can we just take this car, please? Let's get away from there. Let's turn the radio off. So, yeah, the frame time graph has calmed down a little bit as well without the ray tracing on. And yeah, I mean, for Cyberpunk, this frame rate at 4K, granted it is with DLSS on performance, is very much playable, and it looks very, very nice. So I would say I will do a quick benchmark with it like this, and then I will get on to Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, and then we'll see what it's like there. So here we are in Jedi Survivor at 1080p on the high preset without any FSR on at all. The reason I only say FSR is just because this only has FSR 2 in it. So yeah, it's running alright at the moment. It seems like we're just above 60 FPS here. When it gets into combat, I'm not sure. It does have its dips, to be fair. It's not the smoothest experience in the world during combat. As you can also tell by like the frame time graph as well, that's pretty up and down. So yeah, and bear in mind this is at 1080p. So let's try go up to another resolution and see what happens. So here we are in the menu again, and we're at 4K and everything is still on high, but we've put the AMD FSR onto performance. So now if we come out of that, we're seeing a fairly similar frame rate, maybe a little bit lower, maybe 10 or so lower frame rate. And in combat, actually strangely in combat, it actually seemed to be a little bit better, like a little less stuttery. But you let me know if you think that's the case as well. Oh god, I'm actually going to get my ass handed to me. It's been a while since I've played it. Oh dear. Let's use an ability. Yeah, I'd definitely say that combat, well, I was about to say it's a lot smoother, but there was a pretty big dip there. So here we are after having toggled ray tracing on. And again, with this sort of first generation of RTX, the frame rate does seem to like spike, and you just saw a pretty big spike right there. So yeah, it's not looking fantastic for this. It doesn't really, I mean, even though the frame rate does seem alright, it's not really in a playable place, to be honest. I mean, I just died, so just after I died on the respawn screen, it actually just hard crashed on me, so I had to restart the PC. But then once I restarted it, I played for another 10-15 minutes on the settings that we left off with, and yeah, I think that's how I would play it. So it's not looking too bad for Starfield, because in the end we played both games at 4K with the recommended specs. Granted, there was no ray tracing on, and it did have upscaling tech on. That was DLSS for Cyberpunk and FSR2 for Star Wars. If you did decide to leave the DLSS, the FSRs off at 1080p, you could be looking at around 30 to 60, in between maybe 40, 45 FPS in Starfield, which would be my rough guess. But to share with you the benchmarks that I did get for these two games, even though it's not really a benchmark video. So Cyberpunk at 4K with DLSS on performance at the high settings with ray tracing off, we got an average of 58 FPS. We had a 1% low of 34, and then we had a 0.1% low of 29, which, to be fair, that's pretty damn good. With DLSS on performance, it still looked relatively good. Not quite as good as native 4K, but like not really anything in it that I could tell anyway. But then again, it might be because I wear glasses. And then going into Star Wars Jedi Survivor, again that was at 4K, the high settings with ray tracing off. This time with FSR2 on performance as well, and in the end we ended up with an average of 50 FPS with a 1% low of 25 and a 0.1% low of 20. So very slightly worse in Jedi Survivor, which I was actually kind of surprised about, considering we're roughly the same settings realistically. Even though Cyberpunk's like the next Crisis or whatever, or the next like tech demo game. But yeah, so it's good to know that in a game as hard to run as Cyberpunk, and a game that just recently came out in 2023, you can play in 4K with upscaling enabled, and you will get between 40 and 50 FPS, let's say, or 40 and 60 FPS. So it looks like that potentially you could get the same in Starfield, and to be honest, I'd be surprised if the performance is a lot lower than that, because looking at the game, it does look really, really nice, but at the same time, it doesn't look anything like crazy next gen levels of graphics. So I think we'll roughly see that level of performance, but hopefully this video gave you a sort of slight idea of what you could expect for Starfield, depending on what you've got in your own system, or if you're going to upgrade or something like that to some of the parts that are in this PC. But yeah, that's going to be all from me then. So if you liked it, maybe do consider leaving a like. I would greatly appreciate it. And if you've got to this far, then maybe you do really like the channel. Maybe consider subscribing. I would also greatly appreciate that. But that's going to be all from me. So bye.